Jeff Smith is one of the few independent success stories of the 90s. His comic, Bone, which ran for 55 issues between 1991 and 2005, is a beloved classic in both its original black and white form and the color editions published by Scholastic. Bone was Smith's debut in comics. This self-publishing venture seemed to come out of nowhere by a writer and artist who was already fully formed. His skill and talent was immediately obvious, and while it was being published, Bone was mentioned with other independent darlings, such as Cerebus, Hepcats, and Strangers in Paradise. However, Bone was not the overnight success some might presume it must have been. It got very little press coverage, and even though comic books were booming in 1991, its sales were rather dismal for the first few years. At that time, comic book stores were wary of ordering a black and white title by an unknown creator during a time when full-color superhero adventures were selling in record numbers. Despite the odds being against him, Smith continued on, and with sheer tenacity and some wise choices, he produced a piece of work that continues to appeal to a new, all-ages audience year after year. Smith's main inspiration wasn't from comic books, but from newspaper comic strips. Most notably, Pogo by Walt Kelly, Peanuts by Charles Schulz, and Doonesbury by Gary Trudeau. The cartoony style and the distinctive manner of speech in Pogo having the most noticeable effect on what would become Bone. But Doonesbury's repeating four-panel structure would also influence the comic. Additionally, Smith was intrigued by the adventures of Uncle Scrooge and his nephews in the Carl Barks-produced Disney comics. Part of the inspiration for Bone was casually wondering what the Uncle Scrooge story would look like if all the stories were one epic tale with a sense of actual danger for the main characters. Overall, Bone was a mix of many various influences, such as the Bugs Bunny cartoons and the Lord of the Rings novels. At a very early age, Smith began creating comics with the three Bone characters. Phone Bone was first, then came Phony as a counterpoint to Phone's lovable personality, and finally, Smiley, who was a nice guy but easily convinced to help Phony with his scams. It wasn't until Smith went to university that he pursued his dream of being a syndicated comic strip artist. There were no classes at university that taught comic art, so Smith decided to teach himself by drawing every day. To that end, he took one journalism class so he could work on the student newspaper, The Lantern. Once there, he produced a daily strip called Thorn. This forced him to sit down for 2 or 3 hours every day to create 4 panels of art. Through trial and error, and by consulting the work of his favorite artists, Smith taught himself cartooning. It's time for a quick, self-promotional insert. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you're new, subscribe to the channel. I also have a Patreon and a very active Discord available. Details are down below. Thank you for your time. The strip introduced almost everyone that would play a part in the Bone comic. Naturally, there's the 3 Bones: Thorn, Grandma Ben, the Hooded One, the Red Dragon, Rockjaw, and the lovable but equally terrifying rat creatures, all of whom look almost exactly like they would in the comic book. While the strip began as a standard joke-of-the-day type of comic, with more than a few inserts of Smith himself and some political satire, there was an ongoing adventure story that emerged. This story never reached an end, but it would be the foundation for the Bone series. The strip ran from September 20th, 1982 until May 24th, 1985. It was cancelled, so to speak, to make room for other strips. Soon thereafter, Smith quit university and started an animation studio with 2 friends. While working and running this business, Smith began submitting Thorn to newspaper syndicates. For years, Smith tried to change the strip to meet the needs of the syndicates. A few were interested, mainly for the potential of creating merchandise around the cute Bone characters, but none were interested in an ongoing adventure story. They all wanted something that was basically the Smurfs, but with the Bone characters. But Smith didn't want to produce a generic comic strip that strictly appealed to children. He wanted to do the adventure story that had formed in his head. He wanted to put these 3 characters in a fantasy setting, surrounded by humans and other magical creatures, and do an epic story like Lord of the Rings. Unable to find a newspaper syndicate interested in that concept, Smith started thinking about other options. The idea for Bone to become a comic book came from a very unlikely source: The Tick. Smith's mother had given him an issue of the comic, and he loved it. Not being a comic book fan, Smith was unaware that self-publishing had become a thing in the 80s. Being in creative control and doing the story he wanted to do was very appealing to him. Smith also discovered Cerebus, a sword and sandals comic about an aardvark. It was a reasonably successful, self-published title that developed into one long, epic story. The setting itself, an animal lead character among humans in a fantasy setting, proved to Smith that what he wanted to do with Bone was possible, and there was an audience for it. After doing research about self-publishing, Smith sat down and created the first issue of Bone. He changed the title to Bone instead of using Thorn, because the adventure would be focused around the bones from Boneville. Overall, Smith knew the entire story he wanted to tell. In fact, before the series began, Smith wrote the last 3 issues first, so he knew exactly where the series was headed. However, he left some details open and allowed the characters to develop organically. This organic approach is seen very early on with the Great Cow Race. This was, arguably, the story that solidified Bone's popularity. Originally, in his outline, the story went like this. The Bones are chased out of Boneville and end up lost in a desert. They get separated and all end up in the valley. From there, they look for each other. They are then reunited in Barrel Haven. While there, Phony makes a bet with Lucius in order to get rich before they leave for Boneville. Smith knew Phony would lose the bet, and this was how the Bones remained in the valley, but he wasn't sure of the exact details. What Smith didn't anticipate was reader reaction to a throwaway line about a cow race. Many wrote in, looking forward to seeing the cow race. But it was a sequence that Smith hadn't intended on doing. It was just a funny idea he threw in as a joke. So, because of reader interest, Smith added the cow race. And, in order to keep the Bones in the valley, he had Phony start a betting scam. This scheme fails, and Phony becomes indentured to Grandma Ben and Lucius. This is how Smith kept the Bones in the valley after they were reunited. Smith also had the benefit of using jokes that originally worked in the Thorn comic strip, and throwing away everything that got a negative reaction. That's why the first few years of Bone are highly amusing and all the jokes land. What might not be well known is Smith rewrote and did new artwork for some scenes in the collected editions. The scene where Grandma Ben reveals Thorn as a princess was different in the comic than it was in the subsequent collections. Again, due to reader input, Smith thought that pivotal scene didn't land as well as it should have, so he took the time to add more dramatic lighting and change the pace of the dialogue. While not a new scene, it was much longer and changed to have more impact. Spoilers will be kept to a minimum and limited to the basics of the overall story. I don't want to ruin it for anyone who has yet to read it. The comic begins with the 3 Bone cousins, Phone, Phony, and Smiley, being chased out of Boneville. They wind up wandering a desert where they find a mysterious map that leads them to the valley. The Bones get separated and have to search for one another. Along the way, they meet the people and animals that inhabit this valley. There's Thorn, Grandma Ben, Lucius, and the Red Dragon, to name a few. They all seem to live a peaceful life in the secluded wilderness. Threatening that peace are the rat creatures. They are led by the monstrous King Doc, who takes orders from the Hooded One. This mysterious person is the emissary of a nightmarish creature from the dreaming, known as the Lord of Locusts. This lord was trapped in stone after manifesting in reality many years ago. With the help of the rat creatures and the Hooded One, the Lord of Locusts is trying to escape. To achieve this, they need Thorn, who is an awakened one or a person capable of bridging the gap between the dreaming and reality. Sacrificing her, or someone like her, will release the Lord of Locusts. This plan fails, but does succeed in giving the Lord of Locusts more power. With that power, he covers the valley in pieces of the dreaming, called ghost circles. Everyone and everything inside a ghost circle disappears, and with the exception of a few isolated regions, the valley becomes a flattened, dangerous wasteland. Those left alive gather together and make their stand to eradicate this ancient evil from this land. It is an epic, seemingly hopeless struggle against a force of nature that cannot be stopped. In the middle of this conflict are the Bone cousins, who try to stay alive long enough to finally leave the valley and return to Boneville. Thematically, the story is about maturing and the loss of innocence. Thorn is the character where this theme plays out. She begins as carefree and happy, sheltered by Grandma Ben from the dangers of the world. Unfortunately, this is always a temporary state. Conflict always invades the peaceful bubble of childhood. As unlikely as it seems, the arrival of the Bones is the event that triggers the end of Thorn's childhood. With them, they bring the knowledge that the rat creatures are pushing deeper into the valley, and they reveal the existence of dragons. The illusion Thorn had lived under begins to crumble. Through the series, she learns about her place in the world, and she accepts the responsibility it brings. The rat creatures personify a mob mentality. Separately, they seem to have unique personalities, but when together, they are a mindless mass of destructive intent. This isn't limited to the rat creatures, though. The people of Barrelhaven also act like a mindless mob from time to time, especially in regards to Phony, who inspires them with rage and through fear, the two main elements that feed a mob. So, there are some pretty heavy elements in the series, but they have a good balance with the hopeful nature of the story, and it never gets too dark or serious. Smith has stated Bone wasn't written specifically for a young adult audience. In fact, he was writing it for people like himself. Since he had full creative control, he decided to follow the example of Pogo, which included very adult topics, but it didn't include adult language or graphic scenes of violence. It was a wise choice that, ultimately, allowed the story to appeal to a wide, all-ages audience. When Bone began in 1991, it was practically ignored. According to Smith, by issue number 4, sales were around 1,000 copies, which was an amount that wouldn't cover the cost of printing. In an effort to gain more sales, he decided to go to a retailer convention, give every retailer a free copy of Bone number 1, and try to encourage as many vendors as possible to order the comic. Over the next year, sales went up slowly. By the 8th issue, it got orders of 3,500 copies, which was still a very low number. Faced with sales that were mediocre but had the potential to rise, Smith made a risky decision that changed the course of Bone. He sold a share of the animation business and used that money to fund creating Bone. Smith decided he needed to dedicate himself solely to the comic instead of splitting his time between cartooning at night and running an animation studio during the day. He knew he had roughly a year before he went broke, so he poured all his energy into doing the comic and getting it more exposure. In total, it took 10 issues before Bone finally saw an increase in sales. The 10th issue saw orders of 8,000 copies. According to Smith, by issue 15, it reached its peak, selling 60,000 copies per issue. Bone may seem like an overnight success, but in reality, it was 3 or 4 pretty lean years of producing a comic that struggled to find an audience. But once it was found, it exploded with popularity. However, even greater success for the series happened when Scholastic decided to expand into graphic novels. In 2005, after Bone had ended, Art Spiegelman, the creator of Mouse, who is Scholastic's consultant, approached Smith and suggested the comic be reprinted by Scholastic in color. It had been partially reprinted in color before, within Disney Adventures, but Smith preferred it in its original black and white form. So Smith originally resisted the idea. However, Spiegelman eventually convinced him to produce a colorized version. Out from Boneville was the first title launched by Scholastic's Graphix imprint. It's safe to say, this version of the story is likely the version most people are familiar with. It rightfully solidified Bone's position as a classic piece of work by a highly talented creator. Because of this release from a high-profile publisher, Bone is one of the most consistently challenged graphic novels in the United States. Between 2010 and 2019, it was the 16th most challenged book. According to the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, some objections were around the smoking and drinking seen in the series. Some objected to the violence, while another objection claimed the Great Cow Race was, quote, politically, racially, or socially offensive, unquote, which is an interpretation that is, definitely inspired. Anyone who reads the comic can't help but wonder, why isn't this an animated movie? Well, there have been 3 attempts, but all 3 projects fell apart for various reasons. The first attempt was a joint production between Nickelodeon and Paramount in 1988. A script was written by Smith, who also signed on to direct. And finally, it was going to be traditionally animated at Smith's former animation studio. The tentative release date was sometime in 2002. Smith even took a year off of doing the comic book to devote time to this movie. Unfortunately, the studio wanted a kid-friendly product, and they suggested a number of changes, such as giving Phone Bone magic gloves and wanting the movie to have an upbeat, happy ending. They also pushed to include Britney Spears and NSYNC songs on the soundtrack. Smith walked away from the project at that point, and the rights reverted back to him in 2002. Warner Brothers was the next studio. In 2008, they attempted to do a movie trilogy using computer animation. This version fell into the classic production hell void. Multiple directors and writers came and went over the next 8 years, with no progress whatsoever. It's not been officially cancelled, but there's been no news about it either. In 2019, Netflix acquired the rights to do an animated series. It went into production, and then was cancelled in 2022. The reason it was shelved is unknown, but it likely has to do with the streaming company floundering in the wake of stock prices dipping and membership numbers falling. At the time of this writing, Bone seems doomed to never come to life in an animated form. In the end, there have been some follow-ups and side stories, such as the miniseries Rose with the artist Charles Vess, Stupid Rat Tales, and more tall tales, all of which is good additional material for those wanting to revisit the Bone world. The main 55-issue series, reprinted in 9 volumes, is the result of one creator's vision that developed over a number of years. It was a combination of influences from numerous sources, combined into one coherent whole. To Smith's credit, he set out to tell the story he always had in mind, in a medium that wasn't his first choice, but proved to be an excellent outlet for his skills. Thank you for watching. Please give this video a like, leave a comment, and if you're not subscribed, do that too. A link to my Patreon is down below, and I would be grateful if you could back my humble efforts. With that said, thanks to all my fine supporters on YouTube and Patreon. I highly appreciate that ongoing support. Thank you so very, very much. Extra special thanks to Constant Disappointment Records, Michael Rookard, Jeff Nicholson, Sicken, Francis De La Cruz, John Nyukes, Andrew Barton, Odin Ashcroft, Ruby St. Dennis, Phil Sagan, Edward Clayton Andrews, Corey Drew, L.S. Gregor, Alexa Zernish, Brian Deaton, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient.